This is the very heart of Boora Bog. Still, when I was born, one of the most extensive, wildest and most undeveloped tracts of raised bog in all of Ireland. And on that account it is one of the first to be taken over by Board for the systematic large-scale exploitation of its vast peat resource when Board was established in 1946. And if we had been standing here in 1946, we would have been standing on the edge of a lake without the slightest sound or sight of human influence on any horizon. But the lake is long gone, because the draining of Lough Boora was the first step in lowering the water table to a degree sufficient for the large peat harvesting machines to move freely across the surface. And the bog itself is now largely cut away. But then, as the years went by, more and more of the half metre to a metre of peat under the bog on the margins of the now drained lake weathered away, revealing this artificial looking ridge of cobbles and small boulders, which became ever clearer as the years went by. At first this was thought to be a trackway of some kind, but closer examination showed it to be a natural feature, part of a rocky storm beach on the eastern shore of a promontory in a much larger lake than the recently drained modern Lough Boora, a lake that existed here following the Ice Age, long before the raised bogs had started to form. But what utterly astonished the archaeologists who came to investigate in the summer of 1977 was that along this short stretch of storm beach there were the charcoal remains of 14 hearths or fireplaces, together with hundreds of stone tools and a large number of bones, the leftovers from the meals of the makers of the stone tools. Bones of red deer, wild pig, small animals mostly, along with the bones of fishes and small birds, perhaps ducks, and with scatters of shells of hazelnuts, showing that these too were an important element in the diet of these people. Among the tools were more than 400 blades of chert, simple tools struck from a core such as this with little evidence of subsequent reworking. But from an archaeological point of view, the most significant tools were more than 200 microliths, the signature tool of the Mesolithic. These microliths are diminutive bladelets and slivers of stone carefully worked along one or both edges and designed to be fitted into slots in wooden hafts in order to provide sharp edges for saw-like tools. Charcoal from the hearths gave a radiocarbon date of between 6,500 and 7,030 BC, which on the archaeological timescale is the early Mesolithic. This discovery at Boora dramatically altered our understanding of the early settlement of Ireland. The hearth assemblage at Boora is thought to represent the temporary presence of Mesolithic people with a nomadic lifestyle, organised around the seasonal abundance of the wild plants and animals on which they subsisted, one of several transitory stations in a cyclical seasonal pattern. Up to this it was thought that the earliest settlers were confined to the northeast coast, while the rest of the island was covered with forest, marsh and bog, and that people were not to be found in the Midlands until the Neolithic period 3,000 years later. What all this shows, very dramatically, is that our human story here in the Midlands unfolds in parallel with the story of the bogs. During the 9 millennia since the peat began to form at Boora, the bogs have recorded not only the story of the changing landscape in its pollen record, but also our human story in the form of artefacts of every kind, belonging to every archaeological period, making the entombing bogs Ireland's greatest repository of archaeological wealth. There are treasures and ornaments of gold and bronze, such as these from the Derrinboy hoard found in a bog near Kilcormac, tools and weapons of iron, trackways of timber and stone constructed to cross the bog and later entombed by its continued upward growth, such as this one leading across the bog to the monastic island of Lemanaghan, coins and ceramics, and things like clothes and shoes from ages past, such as these from Corhill Bog, which are rarely preserved in other contexts. Even human bodies. This hand belongs to a man exhumed from the bog at Oldcroghan in North Offaly. In Gaelic Ireland, say down to the 17th century, much of Ireland was still forested and woodland was carefully managed. The population was low and there was plenty of timber for carpentry and for firewood. But by the middle of the 19th century, the country had become almost entirely deforested. And increasingly, as timber became scarce and the population rose, people turned to the bogs for their household fuel. The only fuel most people had access to for heating and for cooking. These inroads for fuel on the margins at first had little more impact than nibbles around the edges. And the bogs were so vast it must have seemed to people that they would last forever. But as the decades grew into centuries, these annual incursions, these bite-sized incursions, extended further and further into the bog. Turf was cut with a special turf spade known as a slán or slane, and saving the turf was backbreaking, labour-intensive work. In more recent years, the use of small tractor-mounted cutting machines did away with the labour of cutting the sods and wheeling them out to dry on the ground. But there was still the hard work of turning the sods, arranging them in little pyramids, an operation known as footing the turf, and then getting the turf home. But keeping warm aside, the bogs had another value in 19th century Ireland, where the existing land bank could not support the burgeoning population, more farmland. In the early 19th century, there were extraordinary examples of bog being turned into productive agricultural land. This is Crancree in South Offaly. Best known, I suppose, because it is the location for what is surely one of the most spectacular of Offaly's many mushroom stones. Those extraordinary lake edge markers that record the position and the geography of the Great Lake that extended across the Midlands in the late Ice Age. But 200 years ago, Crancree was raised bog 7 metres deep, in which an area of deepest bog was reclaimed by a forgotten bog colonist and remained good pasture decades after his time, even though it was surrounded on all sides by unreclaimed deep bog. Similar gargantuan efforts at reclamation, mostly piecemeal, but sometimes more ambitious, were widespread, especially where deposits of the lime-rich sand of the eskers that weave between the bogs were close to hand to provide that most essential element for ameliorating the acid peat. Providentially so, as it seemed to many contemporary observers.